Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is once again Andy West, who is a senior specialist and training officer at the Philosophy Foundation. He has written for The Guardian, The Times Literature Supplement, and Lino, amongst others. For the past several years, he has taught philosophy in prisons, and he's here today to talk about his first book, The Life Inside, a memoir of prison, family, and philosophy. Hello, Andy. A warm welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hi, Ray. It's lovely to be here. It was such a pleasure listening to this podcast when it used to run regularly, so it's really nice that it's back.
To start with then Andy, the strap line of the paperback version, which I believe has just come out, is a memoir of prison, family, and learning to be free. Perhaps we could start by you just giving us a quick overview of the book around those three areas.
Yes, so the book tells stories about the 4 or 5 years I spent teaching philosophy in prisons and still do today. Conversations with people that are often really, questions, themes, discussions that are important to every life, like questions about freedom or power or time or hope or shame and forgiveness. But perhaps they're even more immediate in a prison setting. And perhaps these are things that people are already thinking about, question of whether freedom is more a mental thing than a physical thing. It's something that somebody who's, doing heavy time in a 6x8 cell might think about, or the question of whether you can control time or whether we're sort of enslaved to it is another question. So it offers all of those conversations and the philosophical insights, the emotional insights that come from them, psychological, the various ways in which people achieve a kind of emotional or spiritual survival in that state as well often comes through in those conversations. The second part of the book, or the sort of second layer of the book, is a personal story, which is about my family. When I was a kid, my brother was in and out of prison, and so was my uncle, and my dad was in prison too. So, the fallout from that for me was a sort of, I suppose, an inherited shame, a kind of sins of the father kind of burden that I carried. And so when I'm having these conversations with people in prison, men, women, various ages, I'm also perhaps seeking my own kind of liberation or freedom as well. So that's where I was going with the sort of learning to be free term in the subtitle.
Was it something that you had thought about a long time to write this book? What triggered it for you to actually start the project?
An accident, actually. I was convinced I wanted to write fiction, short fiction, and wasn't really getting anywhere with it. But one editor who very politely rejected my a piece of short fiction I gave her said, why don't you write about teaching philosophy in prisons? And I didn't want to at first. I really dragged my feet. But once I did, and especially once I put myself into the story in terms of, the horse I had in the race, in terms of my own family, I found that the temperature just went up on all the material. And there was a sort of quest of sorts in amongst all of these anecdotes. And so I published a 5,000 word essay on that, and then that got picked up by a publishing house and ended up turning into a book. So, I didn't think it was very interesting, actually. But actually, once I started writing it, I felt very close to a kind of real faucet of kind of intellectual and psychological ideas and experiences and stories.
So did it sort of write itself, or did you have to really work hard?
Yeah, there was no shortage of ideas or avenues, because you've sort of got a personal narrative. You've also got a philosophical kind of register to you can take it in that direction. And there's also, a kind of social material reality to the lives that are in the book and the stories. And, it's this incredibly powerful institution in our society that says a lot about our society. So it sort of poured out. The editing, and getting a second draft and a third and a fourth and a fifth, that obviously is always hard work. Yeah.
Okay, just to go a bit deeper here, at launch of your book at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, you said the subject of the book is shame and how it is handed down, and how we learn to live despite it. And you said this was the electromagnetic force that pulled it all together. So could you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, you sort of think you're writing a book about one thing, and meanwhile, the material has other plans and it's going in its own direction. And I sort of realized after the first draft, standing back from it, there's this just a lot of stuff about shame, like that kind of inherited shame I spoke about, the shame that is driving a lot of people in prison to fill their arm with heroin, the shame of not being able to provide as a man, and the sort of violence that people will do when acted upon by that shame. And so for me, it was definitely a story about trying to find some way through that, through philosophy, through conversation. And as you say, it comes up with the people that I'm talking to. I asked the men in one chapter, I tell them the story of Pandora's box and all these evils that come out of the box. And I said, what would you put back in? And one of the men said, shame. And, there was a bit of confusion in the room about this. How are you supposed to be good if you never felt shame? And his line was that, maybe it's shame that makes you do bad things, which for some crimes, I think, there's sense in that position. So yeah, it's not a surprise in hindsight. That's what this institution is there to do. It's there to castigate, to exile, to ostracize, to dehumanize. So of course it's going to be about shame, but you don't know that when you're in the thick of it always.
Yeah, I remember someone talking about what's the difference between shame and guilt. You might have come across this, and they give an example where say you're in a relationship and you're unfaithful and you sleep with someone else, and then shame is the feeling that you want to hide away from your friends because of this thing you've done. But like, if you feel guilty can be seen as a more positive emotion, that you often, the response to guilt is the wish to atone. You want to make amends rather than, I suppose it's hard to separate the two really, but I've thought that was an interesting distinction.
Yeah, I've heard them split various different ways, but often guilt is seen as a bit more dynamic and morally, there's a kind of moral growth that can come from guilt because it's about your actions, and what you did wrong and how you might improve. But with shame, it's about identity. It's about I am bad rather than bad, which is perhaps a bit, a bit more convoluted in terms of how it makes people act.
Okay, just going back a bit, what first drew you to philosophy?
Well, our great friend Robert Ellis was key in that, because he was my A-level philosophy teacher, and I wasn't doing great at school. I'd left school with 2 GCSEs, and he was someone who had a lot of patience and could see, a real passion I had for debate and ideas and, you know, obsessive kind of thinking that you get with philosophy, and, you know, gave me a lot of extra support, and still does, in fact, and is still a great friend. Yeah, and I suppose in the context of the book, you know, I talk about living with shame growing up, that kind of sins of the father, rather like having a kind of punishing voice in my head, a kind of executioner, as I call it. And there's something about the law, the criminal justice system, the psychology of shame. It's very black and white. It's a very flattening, it's a very either or kind of way of living in the world, you know. And I suppose what philosophy, kind of one of the freedoms that philosophy can give you in respect to shame, is that kind of ambiguity, that kind of sense that things are much more mysterious, much more complex than we first thought. You know, shame is a kind of full stop on your experience, whereas I feel like philosophy is always elliptical. There's always something left.
There's a great line from on the back of your book from Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, who says that West reminds us that thinking, debating, and learning are not luxuries, but crucial for survival. Urgent inquiries into who we are. Was it with that sort of sensibility that you were drawn to teaching in prisons?
It's very hard to know why I teach in prisons. In a sense, it's very easy to know, of course, but you know, people have sometimes asked me, you know, is it to sort of rehabilitate or reform or something? And I feel like it's a bit. I feel like part of growing up with so many people in prison is I'm slightly inured to the idea of rehabilitation or redemption. I sort of, it sort of misses the point for me. It misses the point, especially about sort of what education is about as well. Not that education shouldn't be transformative, or at least promise that, but it's also about dealing with the kind of is rather than the ought, kind of helping to understand, you know, what's going on here, rather than necessarily, you know, I meet a lot of people in prison who, you know, due to their behavior, due to their makeup, due to their social situation, due to the possibilities we have in our society, change is really hard, you know. And yet I still think even when change is virtually impossible, and I still think there's so many reasons to do philosophy, you know, just for that understanding, that insight, that revelation that you get from it. And another way to answer your question is just that, you know, when I was 6, I visited my brother in prison. And once you kind of have seen that world, once you've glimpsed the edges of it, for me, it was very hard to ever forget it. And the more I've kind of assimilated into middle class culture, the kind of more imperative it's felt to remember that place, you know, and so it kind of came with the responsibility, I think, that journey that I've been on to go back to not forget.
I worked in prison for a number of years as well with the Samaritans. I used to train people inside to become Samaritans, or what the name in prison is listeners. Right. And you must be aware, you have to become there's a potential power imbalance, because you're outside and free, and you're also in a role where you're giving forth and passing information over, but you seem to very comfortably bridge that gap. You know, that potentially you could be seen as do-goody or patronizing in some way, but the atmosphere that you describe in the classroom, they seem very much at ease with you, and you come across as very relatable. Did you have to work on that, or was your background help you, or do you think it was just what did you do to create that that atmosphere that was very conducive for your students to, to open up and reflect?
I think philosophy helps because it's one thing you do when you engage someone with philosophy is you ask them what they think, and it's an invitation for them to share something of who they are with you. And in the book, a lot of people's individuality comes out through the sort of the way they respond to Diogenes or Kafka or Beckett, or and in prison that individuality is kind of leveled. It's you have a prison number, you don't really have a name, you don't really eat dinner, you get fed like an animal. They talk about feeding in prison. So in a way, the fact that I was in such a sort of dehumanizing institution, and then you're coming in and offering the chance for people to find out what they really believe, express what they believe and think. I think that was on my side. In terms of my background, actually, until very recently, I just never told people about my background.
Right.
Partly privacy, partly I didn't want to be seen to kind of be reaching, like, oh, I understand what it's like for you. Because actually, I suppose the sense that my childhood left me with is I really don't know what it's like to be in prison, because I've been that close to it and yet that far away, that's separated from my brother, let's say. But now with my book out, I was in a prison today and the book's in the library there, and I've got students who are reading it, things like that. So now I can't not tell them about it. So
I'm fascinated here, Andy. What has the response been from your students like?
Well, I was a bit nervous because, as you say, there's a power dynamic, and you kind of want to make sure you've done a decent job. I had an ex-student who reviewed the book, a man called Ray Smith, who reviewed the book in a newspaper called the Inside Times, a prison newspaper, and he spoke really warmly of it. So, and like he said that I'd done them proud. So that was really heartening to hear.
Staying on the theme of the students, many of them clearly hadn't access to higher education. However, that didn't seem to get in the way of them being curious, reflective, and in times incredibly insightful. There were so many rich conversations full of insight, poignancy, humor, and real philosophical weight. Could you perhaps give us an example from your class in this regard that that might particularly spring to mind?
Yeah. So I mean, sometimes I had students who had PhDs. If they were lifers and they'd had a lot of support from outside or from charities or organisations of getting an education, but mostly that's not common in UK prisons. I know it's a sort of trope of like American prison documentaries that people who get really advanced qualifications in prison even though they came in with nothing, but I think that's just because there's so many people doing really heavy sentences in America, whereas a lot of people in prison in the UK, it's kind of like it was with my brother, death by 1,000 cuts. It's like 6 weeks inside, 3 months, 18 months, 6 months, 4 months. So you can't really like work on yourself or better yourself in that time. You can just lose your flat and then survive this feral dustbin full of violence, and then you're thrown back out into the world. You can't really do a course or a qualification. So it varied a lot, but there were some people who could talk to me about quantum physics when we were discussing free will, and there are some people who I guess just had a kind of a wisdom that perhaps had come with the confrontation that you really have with yourself in prison, because even if you're kind of a bad boy and you've got the swagger and you're kind of pretending it's all fun and games. In the evening, the cell door closes and you're locked inside, with yourself, and it's just you and this experience. And, I imagine many like grown men, cry and face, well, you were a listener, you were connected to listeners, the kind of existential despair and confrontation that can come in those moments. And so when you're discussing, say, Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was once a slave and believed that he was free even as a slave, people discussing that with like people who can really connect with that on some level, partly because of their prison experience, it has an authority, it has a kind of, it's very humbling at times.
Great. Okay. One thing that I found interesting, there was a chapter on working in a rehab ward, and you explained that the atmosphere was softer and more optimistic than the more general ward. Why do you think that was?
Partly security. So, I have to go through security to get into prison, but drugs still get into prison either through visits or corrupt prison officers or whatever. Whereas this was like a prison within the prison. You had to go through a second layer of security. People on that wing had to do like urine tests very regularly to stay on the wing. So if they were found to be using drugs, they would go off. You had to be clean for a period before you were even allowed to go on the wing. So it wasn't a detox wing, it was people who had detoxed and then actually committed to a kind of full recovery after that. And people didn't go the distance and whatever, but some people did. And it was really kind of impressive, and it kind of makes you think what could be possible if we had more of this kind of thinking in our prison system.
You said there was a time you became numb to prison. Why was that, and how did you address that?
Well, I suppose it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, because I'm writing something at the moment about prison abolitionism, which is an idea that's getting a lot of traction and there's a lot of conversation around it. And it's an idea which I find quite, I suppose, shocking. Not morally shocking or anything, but just shocking in the very contemplation of it. Because I think, losing my brother to prison so many times, he's in the throes of heroin addiction and it's the war on drugs, and meet him from prison and then an hour later he's being stopped and searched. That kind of death by 1,000 cuts, as I called it earlier, it is numbing. It does incline you to dreary resignation. You just end up saying, it is what it is. This is the world. You can't. There's nothing to be gained in protest or defiance.
Do you think it diminishes many people, the experience?
Yeah, it can crush the human spirit, I think. Yeah. And so, I think what you do is you just become very stoic, and you just say, you can't change this, but you can kind of just craft out your own corner of life, assert your own will where you can, and kind of get on with it. And I suppose that is that kind of self-control, that kind of stoic discipline does come with a cost, and the cost for me is a kind of numbness. And that's why I'm kind of very interested in it. I don't know, I'm kind of abolitionist agnostic. I think there's a lot that's desirable about it. I think there's some stuff I'm asking more questions, but that radical spirit that the world doesn't have to just be the way it is, that we can tear it apart, that we can do something new. It's very exciting to me.
Well, just out of curiosity, do you think there need to be consequences for people's actions, though? If people commit criminal acts. How do you balance that? Do you think like things like restorative justice are a better way to go?
There's a lot of advantages to that kind of thing. I suppose what you want when someone's done something wrong is you want to make sure the victim can recover, materially or emotionally or whatever. And you want to make sure that the person who's perpetrated it doesn't do it again and undergo some process of moral growth.
Yeah.
And transformative restorative justice is perhaps one way of doing that. It doesn't work all the time, but it can work sometimes. I suppose our system at the moment is perhaps this idea based on the idea that punishment will either deter crime or create moral growth, and I can't see how it does either very broadly.
No.
I think some crimes it will deter, like crimes that involve a lot of cost-benefit analysis, like fraud or something, where you're kind of playing angles when you commit that crime. It's not an impulsive crime. It's not a crime about belonging, like a lot of gang crime could be. It's driven by a kind of maths, in many ways, and so it might work. Speed cameras probably do reduce the amount of speeding and the amount of car accidents. That's a kind of minor form of punishment. I think when you're starting to punish people for, crimes that just arise so much from their social and material situation, that to me, that's sort of, there's got to be a more creative method for creating a better society there. And then in terms of rehabilitation, prison just puts you in survival mode. It's not. I couldn't think of a more antithetical environment for moral growth. It's just, So
yeah, I agree. Yeah, very much so. Okay, just let's move on to sort of central theme of the book is that, and you touched on this before, is this conflict you have with what you describe as the executioner in your head.
Yeah, so I suppose it's a kind of obscure sensation of guilt, shame, and the kind of the dread and the doom that can come with that. It doesn't, it's a kind of guilt that comes before the act. So, very kind of Kafkaesque in that way, that the sense that you've done something wrong and you don't know what it is yet, but those are just the details. And for me, I think it was a lot about fear of becoming like my father. This kind of, I suppose, a kind of like a Freudian superego, like a kind of twisted superego, like a voice of this kind of tyrant in your head that wants to police and shame and castigate. And it's something I lived with since I was a teenager, and these days I'm very cheerful, I have to say. I think writing the book helped. It's not that I never have those thoughts, but they're far less kind of sticky now, that they happen a lot less, and when they do, they kind of pass through, and I can kind of get on with my life. So it's not like a chronic condition for me right now, but there have been periods in my life where it's been very restrictive and has cost me a kind of place in the world, and a kind of a way of connecting with people.
So the book has been quite cathartic in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose it sat me down and made me kind of really, deal with what was going on. I think there has been some kind of catharsis. Yeah.
I think when I think of my own experience, when I'm a sort of, I can bottle things up, but I always, and I've got a reluctance to, to talk about vulnerability. But when I do, I find it very freeing. But it's overcoming that fear, isn't it? And you can't do more than write a book about it. I was just so courageous of you, really, because there was almost brutal honesty in the book that was very impactful, and I was full of admiration. I was just, it was absolutely fascinating, actually. You're very uncompromising, very unsentimental in the book as well, which I found really moving.
Yes, yeah. I think, I think a lot of memoirs have this, that you sort of, you submit your manuscript, and then, the book's going to be out in a few months. And then you just, one day you're walking down the street and you just stop and think, what the hell did I put that in the book for? You just become, you're humiliated by the fact you're kind of telling the world all of this. And, what good reason could there be for publishing this? And can I buy back the rights now?
Yeah.
But I think the fears around this kind of stuff are that people are going to find you a weirdo, a freak, that they won't relate to it, and that they're going to ask a lot of very intrusive questions. The opposite has happened, in that, I've had lovely correspondence with people who say, oh yeah, like, I have that voice in my head too, or
Yeah.
I've had, my dad was in prison and this is how it affected me, and I didn't really start thinking about that until I read your book. And people want to share their stories rather than being on yours, and that's a big privilege. So
I think this whole notion of the inner critic is very much arguably a Western phenomenon. But most of us seem to have grown up with this to a lesser or greater extent. Obviously, yours was very, very powerful critic, but it's not that. There's this story about the a scientist was once having a chat with the Dalai Lama, and he was talking to him about low self-esteem in the West, and this idea of the inner critic. He didn't know what it was. It wasn't really something that was in his experience, in his own culture. I'm sure they must, I'm sure that does exist, but it took him by surprise anyway. And I think there's something about our culture that perhaps cultivates that anyway, regardless of your personal circumstances. That there's a cultural phenomenon there too, perhaps.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of whether the executioner or that kind of. I mean, I imagine shame and guilt. They're probably present across all cultures, but they probably have a different constellation and a different way of manifesting in the mind. Yeah.
Okay. Well, my last question is a question I always ask people, Andy. How does this all relate to the middle way, if at all?
Well, I suppose one of the things I say in one of the latter chapters of the book is one thing I'm really asking my students to do is hold two thoughts in mind at once and see what happens. So I don't want this to be a kind of, I don't want the classroom to be an environment of like vehement debate and all the, saving face that comes with that, or all of the, aggression and doubling down on your own convictions that come with that. I want it to be a place of inquiry. And often that means, thinking kind of X and not X at the same time. And just having space to have more than one thought in your head at once. And that was a lesson I kind of needed to learn, I think, as well, in terms of the executioner, because it's shame is such a claustrophobic emotion, because it really takes up all the room. It doesn't leave you space. It's a very when it becomes very, very singular, it's very frightening. And there's something about freedom from the executioner is almost like you can have that doomy thought, you can have that negative like guilt voice in your ear, but you can also have another thought. You can also look in another direction. And it's not that for me, I may never be free of those intrusive thoughts. But maybe I don't have to be. Maybe I can still be free even if I'm not free of them, you know?
Yeah.
So, and that for me feels very middle way, that idea of a non-duality. It's not black and white. Just that room for nuance that I think the middle way, you know, champions so much.
Fantastic, Andy. Okay, well, if people wanted to find out more about your work and any future projects, how would they go about it?
So I use social media, but it's really Twitter is the main thing that I use. And I'm Andy W Philosophy. And if you just search me up, there's another Andy West, but he's sort of better than me, and he's got more followers, and he's just annoyingly a better writer. And occasionally I get his fan mail by mistake. People message me as fan mail, which I'm very happy with, and I don't ever sort of tell them that, you know, you've got the wrong Andy West. I just sort of say thank you.
Brilliant.
So, but be careful you don't get him, because he's already got too many followers.
Right.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today, Andy. And I couldn't recommend the book highly enough. I hadn't read a book for a while, and I thought, you know, I might find it. I'd have to read it sort of piecemeal, but it's a real page turner too. I just read it in a few days. I loved it.
Oh, great.
So yeah. Anyway, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, and let's speak soon.
Brilliant. You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.